Welcome. My name is Katina Johnson. I'm a manager in consumer operations, and I think today's talk could not be more timely given next week's historic inauguration. You may recognize Rosa Aguilar's name from her local call-in show called Your Call, and it covers politics and a variety of topics. I'm personally a big fan of the weekly media roundtable. In her capacity as a journalist, Rose also writes for Altinet and does political analysis for the BBC. She was a contributor to the book Red State Rebels, Tales of Grassroots Resistance in the Heartland. And her road to the book that she's here to talk about today, Red Highways, really began after the 2004 election when she decided that she wanted to get beyond the typical media stereotypes and really find out why people vote the way they do. I would also say that as a Texan, I understand how difficult it can be if you're not a Republican. My solution was to move here. So I'm hoping that today's talk she'll be able to give us a little bit of enlightenment on what makes people in red states tick. And then just one final housekeeping issue. If you have a question, please be sure to use a mic. I'll do a little MC and pass the mic around. But we have some folks on VC, and also we want to make sure that we get this recorded properly. So please join me in welcoming Rose Aguilar.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for inviting me, Katina. I'm actually really excited to be at Google because I worked at CNET in the mid-90s, and so this is bringing back lots of memories, the tech world. Once the dot-com bubble burst, I decided I needed to get out and cover politics, which wasn't that different, talking about corporate corruption in a different field. But for those of you who aren't familiar with the radio show, I just wanted to let you know about it because you do get it down here. I live in San Francisco and I don't come down here very often, and I was wondering if the signal would die out, and luckily it doesn't. So it's a daily call-in show that airs from 11 to noon, and we really focus on engaging listeners because unfortunately there's so many layoffs going on in the media right now, and it's very rare for you to actually feel like you matter. You know, when we watch CNN and Fox and these other things, it's just being thrown at you. And what's nice about the show that I host is we engage people. And we never actually do a show unless we can come up with a question for the listener. So for example, today I didn't host because I was here, but it's kind of appropriate. We were talking about how technology affects our brains and how iPods and computers and things affect our brains, and then looking at children who are born into technology, how their brains differ from our brains. And tomorrow we're talking about the new Congress. We're going to talk about what we should look for in the new Congress, what issues are coming up. We're going to talk to a number of groups like the Sierra Club, Common Cause, maybe Planned Parenthood, a number of groups like that, to say, okay, now that you have a seat at the table, what are you working on and how can we get involved? And then, as Katina said, every Friday is our media roundtable, and we invite an international journalist, a mainstream journalist, and an alternative journalist to talk about how the week's news was covered. So, you know, talking about, for example, what's going on in Gaza, we'll probably focus a lot of attention on that on Friday. So these are the kinds of things we do. Next week we're doing the Arctic on Monday, and then we're also talking about gender. So it's really nice. It's a nice, diverse group of topics. So the last couple of years have been kind of insane because we've been spending so much time on politics, and I'm so glad the election is over. Like Katina said, I had the idea to write this book in 2004 because I decided to go to Reno on a number of weekends to talk to people about how they were voting. And I grew up in Petaluma. I'm a California native. And, you know, I live in a bubble. I mean, San Francisco is definitely a bubble. And when I went to Reno, I was very surprised at the, I guess, just the disinformation that people had. And the fact that I met so many people who, so close to Election Day, were still so undecided about who they were voting for. And in my world, that just doesn't happen. On Election Day in 2004, I went to Las Vegas to drive people to the polls. And I recommend, if any of you can, around election time, go to a different place. It's a really, really good exercise in learning how people from other areas think about issues or talking to them about what they care about. And we knocked on doors in an area that must have been an old Super 8 motel that had been turned into public housing projects. And we knocked on doors during the day, and inevitably single moms were home or moms were home taking care of their children. And it was incredible incredible for me to meet people who said, well, my husband has the car, so I'm not going to vote. And I'm thinking, you're not voting? Didn't you know you could get an absentee ballot? And then I'd say, well, if you'd like, we have a van. We can drive you to the polls. Maybe your neighbor can take care of your child. And they'd say, oh, that would work, without asking who we were or what group we worked with. And it was just shocking to me that, people would not vote. I mean, here, in my political junkie world, that's all we talk about. We have, stickers on our cars. I saw lots of stickers on your cars. But, somewhere that's so close to California, it's so incredibly different. So that kind of made me think, all right, I want more of that. I want to find out, I want to meet more people like this, but in very different places, at least based on what I think, Texas, Mississippi, Oklahoma. And then as I was doing the radio show, I just realized that the media is so shallow on so many levels. I'm talking about television media. It's very easy to kind of slam the media as a whole, but television media is so shallow these days. When you think about flag lapel pins, Reverend Wright, when you think about what the media focused on in the 2008 election and how little information we really got about substantial issues, television really does trickle down into print media, for example. And I really wanted to learn more about, Bush voters and Republicans, because frankly, I don't know many in my world. And I wanted to know what was going on in the rest of the country. And I wasn't finding any answers. It was all sort of, well, they're moral issues voters. And I thought, well, what does that mean exactly? Red state, blue state. It was just very shallow. And so one night I have a bunch of books on the floor and magazines that I haven't opened yet, and I almost tripped over them, and I thought, you know what? I can't do this anymore. I'm so tired of preaching to the choir. I'm so tired of just wondering what is going on in this country. I really want to find out for myself and really get past the soundbite, because it's so easy for a reporter who's on a deadline to say, how do you feel about gay marriage? And you answer in 20 seconds. But I don't know that maybe you have a gay sister, but you're just not comfortable with gays marrying in the church. Or how do you feel about Iraq? And you give me one soundbite. And I really wanted to get past that. So I decided that maybe 6 months would be a sufficient amount of time. I took a leave from my job at Your Call. I was actually producing the radio show at the time. And a friend decided to go with me, and we had an auction. A lot of friends donated various goods like web server space, web design, bags, things like that. And we raised $2,000. And I bought a 1984 brown Toyota van off of Craigslist that basically screams, the hippies are coming. Because we made curtains made out of animals, and we put them in the windows. And we had 2 rules: no political stickers on the van, and no political T-shirts on my friend, who's a hardcore activist. And that would prove to be almost impossible, because almost every T-shirt he has something political on it. And he got me in trouble on a number of occasions. We almost got kicked out of a gun show. He got chased in a parking lot of a huge mega church. And I can tell you a few of these stories later. And so we didn't have an itinerary. We just chose the states we wanted to visit. And I basically chose states that I know little to nothing about. We chose Texas for obvious reasons. My friend's family lives in Houston, and Kitina's from Houston, so we decided to start there. And then we shot over to Oklahoma. John Kerry and Barack Obama failed to win one county in the entire state of Oklahoma. And I know nothing about Oklahoma, and I thought, okay, I've got to visit Oklahoma. And then we shot over to Mississippi simply because, from a historical perspective, I've always just been fascinated by the civil rights movement and what happened in Mississippi. And also, in the entire state of Mississippi, there's only one clinic that provides safe and legal abortions in the whole state, just one. And so I've been reading about this clinic and just reading about the protests that go on, the struggles that women face when they go to this clinic. So I wanted to visit the clinic. And then we stopped in Liberal, Kansas. When I saw that there was a town called Liberal in Kansas, I had to stop there. 70% of Liberal voted for George Bush. And then we went through Nebraska, stopped at a few Indian reservations, and then shot over to Utah to take a break to go to Burning Man, which was very surreal in the middle of this exercise or this adventure. And then we went up to Montana because I wanted to go to Montana because it's such a gorgeous state. If you ever get a chance, go to Montana, drive through Montana. It's beautiful. And also, Montanans pride themselves on being independent. And they have their first Democratic governor in a very long time. And so I wanted to see, what was going on in Montana, and also find out if they feel connected to politics, because they're kind of, mountain area, and they kind of actually enjoy being disconnected from DC. So it took us about 2 days to drive to Texas. Before I left, my family and my friends said, what are you going to tell people when you approach them? Because if you say you're from San Francisco, no one's going to talk to you. They're thinking, what Bill Riley tells us about how people feel about San Francisco, that if I say I'm from San Francisco, no one will talk to me. My mother said, please don't go to rural Texas. Can you please go back to Sri Lanka and volunteer? I don't want you going to change people's minds. But the point was not to change minds. I seriously wanted to have conversations without judgment, just as two citizens who care about what's happening in the world. And, challenge when we can, but really just be honest with each other. No talking points, just get past all of that. So I got to Houston, which is a huge city. And I was just looking around, in one of the neighborhoods, and I thought, what the hell am I doing here? I just took 6 months off from my job to talk to people about the two issues you're not supposed to talk about in mixed company, politics and religion. And I'm from San Francisco, and I'm in Texas. So I was trying to come up with some sort of plan. What do I say? How do I approach people? I mean, usually when I'm doing stories about, minimum wage or homelessness or poverty or whatever, you have a goal, and you go to the place where you know that you're going to find people who can tell you about those issues. Well, here I am in Texas, not really knowing anything about the state, and not really knowing anyone except for 2 people. So it was very hot the day that we arrived. It was in March. And I said, all right, where do people in Texas go on a hot day? And so I looked online, and I found it was like the biggest mall in the country. It's a city within a city. And so I thought, all right, let's go to the mall. So I decided to approach people as follows. I said, I'm a journalist from San Francisco, traveling around the country, talking to people about issues they care about. And I said, I'm really sick of media coverage. I'm sick of the O.J. Simpson. I'm sick of the Britney Spears. And I interviewed probably between 6 and 10 people every day for 6 months. I became very obsessed with the trip. And only one person said they didn't want to talk. And that was because we were in the hill country in Texas, and I was knocking on RV doors. A lot of people who are retired live in their RVs full time. And so I thought, all right, I'll just knock on some doors. And one guy was having dinner, and he said, can you come back tomorrow? But everyone wanted to talk. And everyone from, far left to far right, and I don't really like those labels, but they all said they were so tired of media coverage. And they said they wanted substance. Now, we are often told by the media that we get what we want, right? I mean, Iraq comprises about 3% of all headlines, and that's because that's what we want. So I found that really striking. What I also found striking was that people just wanted to talk about issues they care about. Now, I never mentioned the word politics when I introduced myself, because that's kind of a loaded word, like liberal and some of these other words. But when I asked people, when they were kind of hesitant to talk to me, I would say, well, what do people do for work here? Do you have a job? Can you make ends meet? Do you have health care? Does your child go to a good school? All very political issues, but they're not framed in a way that is like, that is sort of conservative liberal. And the conversations were incredible. A lot of people, I'd say 95%, have never been interviewed before because I approached strangers. I wanted to stay away from politicians and the talking heads. I spent a lot of time in Walmart parking lots because they're everywhere in this country. I'd never been in a Walmart until I took this trip. But what we would do is if we arrived in a small town, inevitably the downtown area would be crumbling. There would be cobwebs in the store. The glass would be chipping. And we would bet there's probably a Walmart within 2 miles of this place. And sure enough, there was. And so I would just hang out in the parking lot because they're full morning, noon, and night and approach people. And a lot of people said, I don't often talk about these issues, but thanks so much for asking. And it's also, it made me realize that as sort of a political junkie who talks about this stuff on a daily basis, I often assume that, well, shouldn't everybody have this information? I mean, we have computers, we have blogs, we have magazines, we have all of these things. But people working 2 jobs, 3 jobs, they don't have time to go online. In fact, a lot of people I met don't have computers. And I thought, wow, I'm thinking that everyone has access to technology. I was in South Texas. I met a lot of poor Latinos who don't have access to computers. They can't afford it. I mean, some towns don't even have libraries. So, I mean, you guys are lucky that you have these speakers come, speak at your company at lunch in San Francisco tonight. We have 20 things we can choose from, documentaries, plays, all these things. But in so many small towns, they don't have anything. And it was incredible because they said, we're so concerned. A lot of young people are leaving the small towns because there's nothing for them to do here. There's no options, there's no jobs. In a lot of the small towns, I would hang out in front of military recruiting centers because they wouldn't let me in. And I asked people why they're joining the military. When we were in the Mississippi Delta, it was like being pulled back in time in Mississippi. It's still so segregated, and I had no idea that was the case. They call it segregated on Sundays because it's either a black church or a white church. And so I hung out in the Delta and talked to a number of young black men saying, why are you joining? And they said, hey, lady, what would you do? Would you work at McDonald's or would you join the military? And, as sort of a San Francisco middle class, educated person, it was very good for me to see that because, again, it's so easy to say, why would you work at Walmart? Why would you join the military? Why don't you have the information that is here on a silver platter? A lot of people don't have time for it. When we stopped in Liberal, Kansas, I went to a laundromat to do washing and interviewed people in the laundromat. And I asked a woman, I said, so where do you get your news? And I asked everyone this, and she said, news? It doesn't take a rocket scientist to know what's happening right now. She said, the policies that the Bush administration has passed affect me first. And I said, well, what do you mean? And she said, I am a health care provider and my wages haven't been raised. I don't have health insurance. My kid's school has mold in it. I don't have to read the news to know what's going on. And I thought, wow, thank you. Yes, you're right. For me, do you read the New York Times? Do you check this alternative blog? But no, it affects people directly. And it made me realize how disconnected I think progressives are from poor communities, lower class communities. Well, what does that even mean anymore? Middle class communities. I think that we're very disconnected from that. And what's sad with journalism, people being laid off and consolidation, is that those voices don't appear in the media. We did a show about labor on Labor Day, and Stephen Greenhouse from the New York Times was a guest, and he said he's only one of 2 labor reporters, newspaper reporters, in the entire country. There's just 2 labor reporters in the entire country. So the other thing that was really striking to me was just the stereotypes that we all have. I mean, I met so many Republicans who we don't see in the media. I stopped, for example, at Planned Parenthood whenever I saw one, and I said, what is it like here? Do you have funding? What is it like with the groups that are trying to shut you down? And inevitably they said, if it weren't for the Republicans, we wouldn't have funding. The Republicans are the ones who give us most of our money. And I thought, interesting, why don't we hear from them in the media? There are 2 pro-choice Republican groups in D.C. that I think have about 500,000 members, but we never hear from them in the media. There's also a group called Republicans for Environmental Protection, and I met 3 members in Dallas, and they oppose offshore oil drilling. They would never be caught dead driving a Hummer. They drive to recycle. In a lot of towns in Texas, they don't have curbside recycling, so they drive to the library to recycle their newspapers, and then they drive to another area to recycle their cans. And they said, we believe that Bush will go down in history as the worst environmental president. And I said, well, why don't we hear from you? Why aren't you out in the streets or on CNN or in articles? And they said, we're just not activists. A lot of the moderate Republicans I met said they feel like there's no place for them right now. That the party has completely left them, and they just don't feel welcome in any party. I also just found that, once you get past the soundbite, you have a lot more in common than you would assume. I know that it sounds kind of hard to believe, but so many people invited me into their homes without even knowing anything about me. That was also shocking, that someone would say, oh, you've got to meet my friend Greg. He voted for Bush in 2000, and he voted for Nader in 2004. Or you've got to meet my friend Katrina. She's 65, and she just went to her first anti-war rally ever. And they'd call these people, and they'd say, oh, this woman is in town from San Francisco interviewing people, and I really wanted to meet you. And they'd say, oh, great, have her come over. And I'd go to their home, and I'd say, well, don't you want a business card, or don't you want to know if I'm really a journalist? And they'd say, oh, no, just come on in. And they'd have cookies and lemonade waiting. And that would never happen in San Francisco. They would Google you first, right? And then they'd meet at a cafe, probably in a different neighborhood. I mean, the Southern hospitality that I found was incredible. One story that really stands out when we're talking about trust is I went to church every Sunday as part of this project because I wanted to learn more about pastors bringing politics onto the pulpit. And we never really knew what we were going to find because a lot of the names are kind of misleading. Um, for example, when I was in Missoula, Montana, I kind of got so tired of going to church by that point. But I found a church called Open Door Baptist, and I thought, oh, that sounds welcoming. I'll check that out. It was one of the most frightening churches that I think I've ever walked in. It was small like this, and the pastor was just screaming about sin and, if you leave your child, he might be molested, and I mean, really frightening things. But when we were in the Mississippi Delta, I asked one of the hotel clerks to give us a recommendation for a church. And he said, oh yeah, there's a really nice Baptist church. I think you'll like it. And so I'm thinking that I might walk into a black church. I don't know why I thought this, maybe because the hotel clerk was black. And we walked in, and it was all white, very affluent. And all the little kids were waving little American flags. And the pastor started talking about how the gays are ruining America, how Hollywood is ruining America, how when Arabs are born, they're taught to hate and kill Jews. And the woman sitting next to me had this really nice yellow pressed suit on. She had white gloves on with her rings on the outside of the gloves. You could tell that she had spent a lot of time on her makeup and her hair was perfectly coiffed. And this service was so negative. In fact, toward the middle, as the preacher's voice started to increase, the little kids' flags were on their laps and they were looking very frightened. And after the service, the woman grabbed my arm and she said, oh, honey, it's so nice to see you here. It was very obvious that we weren't from a lot of these places, so people knew we were just, visiting. And I said, well, thank you, but, I have to be honest with you. The service was really negative. Is it always like this? And she turned around, and she said, I don't like this pastor. We're all just waiting for him to leave. And I thought, really? And I said, so I'm this journalist in San Francisco talking a mile a minute. I'd love to interview you. And she said, well, I've got a ladies' lunch at 3. Why don't y'all come by at 5? And I said, okay. So she scribbles her phone number down and gives me a little piece of paper. And then in the meantime, we were talking to some of the other churchgoers saying, do you really believe what this pastor tells you? And they said, no. Are you from around here? And we said, no, we're from San Francisco. And they said, no, we don't believe everything. It's just, this is what we're used to. It's the South. Duh. And that's sort of what they were saying to us. And I said, right. So 5 o'clock rolls around, and I call our friend, and she says, I'm waiting for y'all. So we show up, and she's wearing these nice little jeans with this pastel top, and she has cookies and lemonade waiting. And this woman, I write a lot about her in the book. She was such a character. She would talk for a good 10 minutes, so fast, about growing up in the South. Her father owned a farm. She talked about living amongst sort of slave children, talking about going to the churches because she loved their music. And then every once in a while she'd say, so what brings y'all here? Have y'all traveled overseas? And we'd give her one answer, and then she'd go again for 10 more minutes. Now, she would not reveal how she voted, but she did say that she always canceled her husband's vote. So I thought that was very revealing. But this is the thing that was amazing. If I would have left that church without talking to her, I would have believed that everyone in that church agreed with their pastor. So again, for selfish reasons, this made me realize that so many people in the South are raised with the church, and a lot of people here who don't go to church. In fact, a lot of people in Mississippi did not say, "Do you go to church?" It was, "What church do you go to?" In the media, I think they bring on Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, but they never talk to anyone else. There's so many progressive pastors in these areas. In Austin, Texas, we went to a Presbyterian church, and the pastor said from the pulpit that when he gets depressed about Iraq, he watches The Daily Show. And he said this from the pulpit. I found another church in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Incredible pastor. Actually, 60 Minutes has featured him. He was a hardcore evangelical, black preacher, very good looking, nicely dressed, with a lot of money. He studied under Oral Roberts. When Colin Powell was still in the Bush administration, he would call Colin Powell on a weekly basis. That's how much access this guy had. And he told Colin Powell, whenever W is around, or whenever the television cameras are on W, I never want to see him without a black person standing behind him. This guy rode in jets with all of these wealthy pastors. But he said he had an epiphany. He was watching television and watching a segment on, I think it was AIDS in Africa and starvation in Africa, and he saw little babies who were really hungry. And then he was coming home from an event, and he felt like he just got so tired of saving everybody. He would save the person to his left and to his right, and he would never be able to sleep. And so he said, I just don't think that everybody's going to go to hell. So he came to church one Saturday or Sunday and said, next week I want you to bring your gay brothers and sisters, your atheist brothers and sisters, and your Muslim brothers and sisters to church. From now on, I'm going to preach inclusion. And he lost 95% of his church. Now, when I went to church that Sunday, it was a huge church. Have you all ever been to a mega church? No one? A few. You should definitely go to a mega church. It's such an experience. Huge. I mean, it's a production. Screens on stage, sometimes a band. Now, the balcony was totally empty. The side seats were completely empty. Just this section was full. And so I'm thinking to myself, who are these people who are still here? Because 2 weeks ago, this guy was preaching fire and brimstone, and today he's preaching inclusion. This is a radical transformation. Why are they still here? So after the Sunday services, I would often go to the pizza party they would have, or the buffet. In some cases, the big mega churches, they have a Starbucks on campus. Actually, kind of like, it looks like this, right outside. And so I went to this luncheon at this church, and I sat with about 10 people, and I said, I don't know how to ask this question. I think I'm just going to be blunt here. Have you all been living a lie? Because this message is so different from what you heard 2 weeks ago. And they said, you're not from around here, are you? I heard that a lot, and I said, no. And they said, you have to understand that those of us who are brought up in Southern Baptist churches are taught to never question anything. We allow ourselves to feel up to about here, and then it stops. And deep down inside, we were craving for this message, but we just didn't know where to find it, and we didn't allow ourselves to seek it out. And these were 50, 60-year-olds, and they had tears streaming down their faces. And they said when he came to church that day and started preaching inclusion, it was like something lifted from my shoulders. And they said we lost a lot of our friends because we still go to this church, but we feel like we're actually speaking our truth for the very first time. And I just thought that was so powerful, and it really made me wonder how many other people are feeling like this. When we were in Jackson, Mississippi, I needed to take a break because you interview six to 10 people talking about healthcare and education and gay marriage and abortion, and it's overwhelming. But I was trying to take a break at a cafe, and I saw two young women reading a book about wealth and Christianity, and I thought, oh, God, I interview them. And my friend said, no, you're taking the night off. I said, no, I have to figure out why they're reading this book and who they are. It was a really, really good interview with these two Christian girls who basically are in their early 20s, and they said, in a nutshell, my church tells me to vote Republican, but my heart tells me to vote Democrat. And they said a lot of young people that we know are really questioning the support for the church, the issue that the church focuses on, which is gay marriage and abortion. And they said, we're both kind of hesitant. We don't really know how we stand on those issues, but they said they are focused more on poverty, consumption. One girl said, I'm struggling right now not knowing whether I should volunteer on the other side of the tracks in Jackson, Mississippi, or go to Africa. So I found that with a lot of the young people that I met, that they're really kind of trying to figure out who they are and what issues really mean a lot to them. There are a lot of churches just geared toward young people. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, there was a church that I went to that looked kind of like a cross between an Apple store and Virgin Records. Because when you walk in, I'm not kidding you, there's like 100 iPods blaring Christian music, and state-of-the-art computers lining the walls, and gorgeous bars offering fruit juice. But nevertheless, they look like bars. I mean, beautiful architecture. And it's incredible because the kids are not wearing conservative clothing to these churches. They're wearing spaghetti tank tops and jean skirts and ripped-up jeans, and it's very kind of hip. because in a lot of these places, there's not much to do. And so, okay, the question is, is there anything wrong with this? Now, when I first went to the mega churches, it kind of scared me because everyone was doing the same thing. Whether it was, screaming up and down with the Bible in their hand, or feverishly taking notes when the pastor was talking about, how to deal with your marriage. But then as I went to the Southern Baptist church that were much more kind of in your face, the mega church just seemed like a really bad self-help class. Because they talk a lot about, marriages and your kids and saying no more often. But the underlying message is you vote how we want you to vote. And at one mega church in Austin, they had images of Martin Luther King Jr. and Mother Teresa. And the pastor said, I want you to be peacekeepers. Now, after all of the services, I interviewed the pastors. And there have been so many books written about religion, but it's very rare to hear from the pastor's perspective unless they are the Jerry Falwells of the world. And I think that's the case because I didn't go in as sort of an official reporter. I just went in as someone who was working on a project. I didn't lie about who I was, but I'm not very threatening looking, and it was very hot, so I had my hair in a ponytail, and it was very casual. Now, a lot of reporters go in kind of, I'm Mr. Reporter, and I'm going to deal with your press office. I got interviews with every single pastor. One pastor in Jackson, Mississippi. It's a mega church, 3,000 people, 3 services every Sunday, and I went to their Let Freedom Ring event. It was right around 4th of July. They had a 200-person choir on stage. It was almost like an opera house. In the beginning of the service, they were flashing images of the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines on stage, and then they did a reenactment of Iwo Jima. And the pastor invited a man on stage who was kidnapped in Iraq. He was a private contractor for KBR. And he came on stage and talked about his ordeal. And then he ended by saying, we all need to support the president because he's freeing the Iraqi children. And 3,000 people stood up and gave him a standing ovation. And I thought, am I at church or am I at a military event? It was very striking. So after the service, I interviewed the pastor, and I said, is this common? And he said, well, it's 4th of July. We're just paying our respects to the president and what's going on in Iraq. And so we talked about that, and then for some reason he decided to reveal to me how much money they bring in offerings. So you've got 9,000 people a day. This is not tithing, just offerings. Can anybody guess? Throw out a number anyway. 9,000 people a day. 100,000? Very good. 120,000 every Sunday. And so I said, well, so do you help the poor? And he said, well, we've kind of dropped the ball on that. They just built a multi-million-dollar gym there. They have counseling for drug addiction, alcohol addiction. If you're having issues with your wife, they have counseling for that. They have mountain climbing classes for your kids, dancing lessons for your kids, singles nights. I mean, everything is in the church. You don't need anything else but that. And for a lot of communities, that's really all they have. So the church service was very eye-opening for me, but what I found was at the progressive churches, United Church of Christ, for example, all-inclusive, the Presbyterian Church in Austin, where he cited The Daily Show, I met a number of Republicans. When I went to the mega churches and the Southern Baptist churches, I met a lot of Democrats. And now, I hardly cite Greens or independents, other than in Montana, because in Oklahoma, you can only vote for a Democrat or a Republican, and in a lot of places, they don't vote for third parties. That's just the way it is. I mean, in Texas, I met Democrats who whispered that they were the only Democrat in their neighborhood. I was at a very affluent area in Highland Park, right outside of Dallas, and I would meet people who would say, I'm a Democrat, but I'm the only one in my neighborhood. And then 5 minutes later, I'm a Democrat, but I'm the only one in my neighborhood. And I said, well, maybe if you put a sticker on your car like your neighbors, you would realize that you're not alone. Because I got to say, when we first arrived in Texas, it was so bizarre to be surrounded by W stickers and thinking women vote Republican stickers. It was just the opposite of San Francisco. I mean, of course there are Republicans in San Francisco and they don't dress their cars with the Republican stickers, but it was just so opposite. And it just made me realize how, what a bubble I live in. And the culture is so different. For example, the religion. Democrats say, why are you guys ripping on us going to church? Stop. We care about social justice and poverty, but maybe that's not part of your fabric, but it is part of ours. There was just a story on NPR yesterday when they were interviewing people. I think it was people the guys who were trying to run the RNC. I think they're all men. They were asking them what kind of guns they own, and they were just talking about all these different guns. It's just part of the culture. I just want to tell you one other story that's kind of funny about gun culture. We went to a gun show in Oklahoma City, and we walked in with big backpacks because I had all of my equipment, computer, I have a digital recorder, and we always got stares. And one guy approached us and said, well, if I didn't know any better, I'd think y'all are terrorists. And I said, well, thanks for being honest, because everybody else just stares at us. So that guy introduced us to one of his friends who was selling AK-47s and semi-automatics. I have never seen an AK-47 in my life. And there were Confederate flags hanging from various booths. And the guy that was selling the AK-47s was in a wheelchair, and he was very skeptical of us because my friend was wearing a political T-shirt. And I forgot what it said, but his eyes were staring at my face because he was in a wheelchair. And he said, we don't see many of them shirts around these parts. And I thought, okay, this is the friend who gets me in trouble. I said, go back to the snack bar and don't move. I'm going to do a few interviews and then we can leave. So I walked around and did interviews with people selling knives and newspapers on 9/11. And I found mostly Republicans, but I found a lot of hardcore Constitution Republicans who are just upset at everybody. Now, as I walked back to the AK-47 guy, he, for some reason, invited me into his booth. And he said, all right, tell me about your project. And he had the other workers separate the tables for me so I could walk into the middle. And so I told him about the project. We ended up spending 2 hours together and talking about everything from healthcare to gun culture to Iraq. Now, the Iraq part of the conversation was so fascinating because up to that point, I had met so many veterans. It's very easy to meet veterans in small towns. Walmart parking lots. I mean, I would, drive into an empty spot, start talking to the guy next to me, and sure enough, he just got back from Iraq. And I also went to a number of nonprofits that are trying to help veterans, with the most simple things, like getting to their appointments, because a lot of the disabled vets live in rural areas and they can't make their appointments. And a lot of these groups are losing money. They can't even buy gas for their vans, and they say that the community's not supporting them. So I was telling him about this and saying, do you really think that this administration is supporting the troops? Because I have met at least a dozen veterans who are not getting the care they deserve. And he said, look, I served in Vietnam. I have told my wife that if she puts me in a VA hospital, I will haunt her for the rest of her life. And so I think it was just, we found a level of trust. And in the beginning, he was very hardcore. I'm pro-military, I'm pro-war, I don't like war, but I'm pro-war. But then when we talked about it on a human level, and then he told me that Jane Fonda should be shot. This happened so many times. I'd be talking to somebody, and then they would just throw me this, hit me in the face, and it was just, I didn't know how to respond. And so I said, would you be willing to read information from Iraq vets against the war? These are guys who were for the war, but then when they got to Iraq, they saw what was going on. They feel like they've been lied to. And he said, all right, I'll read it. So it takes time to do this. I'm not saying it's easy, but we were able to really have dialogue. And we actually carried around what we called a fact folder with us because people would think that we were lying when we would say, well, the weapons haven't been found, or no, they're not in Syria, or they'd say, well, no, that's not true. So we started carrying around articles to give to people. And they'd say, oh, that's Knight Ridder, that's liberal. Oh, that's AP, that's liberal. Oh, that's Reuters, that's liberal. Everything was liberal. Even Harvard studies, liberal. So we started printing articles from Fox.com because they couldn't call it liberal, right? And we would find articles about WMD, about how vets are being cared for. And then we also printed out voting records from legislators because in Texas, very few Republicans have voted on bills to increase funding for veterans care. And I would meet people with the Support Our Troops ribbons, and they'd say, yeah, it's the Republicans who support the troops. And I'd say, well, here's the voting record. And they'd say, no, that's liberal. And I'd say, no, it's from Senate.gov. and I didn't do it to be mean or to make fun of anybody. That was not the point of the trip. It's too easy to make fun of people or to make them sound silly. Watch the Colbert Report, every night. that wasn't the point. It was about, let's share information and let's just speak in a real way with respect. I mean, it wasn't always respectful. I met people who were not only against abortion but against birth control. I've never met anyone like that. I met some far, far right activists, but they were never mean. That was the thing. Are you familiar with freerepublic.com? It's a hardcore conservative website. Yeah, I mean, I met people who go on that website. It was never mean, as long as I just found that if I was respectful and kind of honest, we could have a dialogue. And I just wish that the media would do a better job of giving these people a voice, so we would realize that it's not so black and white or so red and blue. There's so many more nuances to how people feel if you just get past the soundbite. And I found this constantly on this trip. Now, at the gun show, just quickly, right before I left, the AK-47 guy said, "Hey, if you're ever back in Oklahoma, I'd like you to come to my ranch. I'd like to fix a barbecue for you." And I'm wearing my vegetarian t-shirt. And it was the only thing that was clean. We didn't bring that many clothes. And I said, "Oh, that would be great." And he said, "If I didn't know better, I thought all San Franciscans were tree-hugging liberals." And I said, "Well, Dave, how do you know I'm not?" And he went, "Oh, but I liked you. But I'm not supposed to like you." And I heard this a lot from people. I felt like that. They thought that they wouldn't like me, and I thought I wouldn't like them, but lo and behold, we were able to talk. So I'd love to take any questions you might have.
Um,
Oh, and Katina has a
actually,
microphone.
actually, I'm going to go ahead and just put it here since we have such a large crowd. So just come on up.
So on the one hand, you observed, like at the church, that all those people said, "Oh, we don't believe any of that stuff. We're not stupid." But on the other hand, you talk to a lot of people who said, "Oh, that's liberal. I don't believe that."
Yeah.
And so it seems to me there's this strain. I didn't quite understand from what you were saying how much there is real, well, pardon me, conservative misinformation that's out there. How deeply it's penetrated.
It's deep, but I found that if you have an hour to spend with someone, it's not so black and white. It's just reactionary. I mean, I think people who watch cable news, for example, which I think they've completely ruined our society on many levels, they kind of talk to you like you're asking them, like you're a TV anchor, and they give you a soundbite. But then when you dig a little deeper, you realize it's not so black and white. I mean, inevitably, when I would meet people who wanted to talk just about gay marriage and abortion, you would find out that they have gay family members, and it's not so black and white. But it takes time to find that. That's the problem. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of misinformation out there. I'm not pretending there isn't. There's a lot. But what I found also is that a lot of the hardcore conservatives, and this isn't so surprising, they solely rely on Fox News. I mean, a lot of the Bill O'Reilly guys that I met are really angry people. They would say, "Liberals hate America." And I'd say, "Well, can you define liberal, sir? What does that mean exactly?" And they'd get flustered and say, "Well, I'm late for an appointment." And they'd walk away. I mean, they were never able to define these terms that are thrown at us on a daily basis. I mean, even now, the narrative in the media is that this is a center-right country, and Obama better be careful, because if he, if he decides to place a bunch of conservatives or progressives in his cabinet, there's going to be hell to pay, because it's a center-right country. What does that mean exactly? Right. So, yeah, I mean, it's tough because do people have time to spend? I mean, one of my wishes is to get a van and put a radio studio in it and drive around the country and have community meetings so we can actually talk about these things outside of our bubbles. Because I found that people were really craving information, but there's a lot of fear and there's a lot of misinformation. But once you get past that and maybe provide information in a non-threatening way, people were open to it. And I found a lot of the lefties, liberals, whatever you want to call them, oh gosh, they were armed with so much information. I met this really great guy in Indian country in Oklahoma in his 60s, and he had a bag of books with him of right-wingers. And he said, "I listen to Rush. I'm reading Bill O'Reilly's book right now. I need to keep track of what they're doing." I never met anybody on the right who said, "Yes, I read The Nation magazine because I need to keep track of what they're doing." But so many people on the left said, "I keep track of them. I watch their shows. I read their books. I listen to their radio shows." I never got that from people on the right. I mean, I don't think NPR is very liberal, but people didn't even say I check NPR to see what they're doing. That was kind of striking.
You talked a little bit about sort of lower class, middle class, upper class, and one of the things that I think has at least been talked about a lot in recent years is sort of the disappearing middle class, sort of widening income coming gap. Um, I don't know how much of that we observe or how much of the reality of that we observe in this area, so I'd love to hear what you observed with that and how you think it's influencing people's views on these issues.
Yeah, you're right. From the poor to the middle class. So, for example, in South Texas, I stopped in a town called Crystal City, and there were 3 women selling tattered clothing at a garage sale at a school. And I stopped to hang out with them. They were selling candy apples and bottled water. And these women are all in their 50s and 60s, and they work 3 jobs, making minimum wage. One woman works in a taco stand at Head Start as a cook and in the fields. And minimum wage in Texas, well, now at the federal level, it actually is going up, I think this month, to $7.25 for the first time in 10 years. But she was making, I think, a grand total of $21,000 a year, 3 jobs. This woman was so well informed because, again, the policies hit her. So she's got friends who are in Iraq. You know, she has no health care. Her minimum wage hasn't been increased. So there's that level. Hardcore Democrats in this area. In Bartlesville, Oklahoma, I stopped at a fire engine station. I realized that I hadn't talked to any city workers. And there were about 8 guys hanging out, and I just approached them and said, you know, can I talk to you about what life is like here? Do you guys make ends meet? And these guys just opened up. It was incredible. They were all Republicans. But they said because of their financial situation, they have to volunteer many hours at the fire station because the city budget is so strapped for cash, like all of our city budgets. And then they have to have a job at night. And so they rarely see their kids and their wives. And they said, you know, I'm thinking that this Republican Party cares more about money than me. And I just found that as gas prices went up, gay marriage and abortion was not as important. People wanted to talk about the economy. And it's been sold, the social issues have been sold so well over the last 8 years that now that it's hitting people's pocketbooks, I definitely am seeing a shift. Those guys at the fire station were just so adamant about how their pocketbooks have just changed. And, you know, they don't really talk about these issues. I mean, they said, so this whole tax cut thing, did that really help us? We were told it was supposed to help us, but we're thinking that it went to the people at the top. And then the other thing that was interesting is they knew the economy was going to crumble because they said there's no way that my neighbor could have bought that home on her salary. Her mortgage is really low. How did that happen? And they said, we know something is not right. Something is going to crumble. And sure enough, it did. So, yeah, I mean, I think we talk about this a lot on the show, how these voices are missing from the dialogue. It's all about Wall Street and it's all about the bankers. But what about people at the bottom? And, you know, Obama is talking about the middle class. He's appointing a middle class czar, I believe, to focus on how his policies will affect the middle class. But what does that mean? I mean, he never even really mentioned the word poor or poverty when he ran. Regardless of what you think about John Edwards, he talked about poverty a lot, and then he had an affair, and the guy's been missing in action ever since. So nobody's really talking about poverty. But, yeah, and we've had a lot of economists on. David K. Johnston, who is a former tax reporter with the New York Times. His book is so good. It's called Free Lunch. He said that this year is going to be so much worse than last year. We're going to see major, major job losses. And that's going to really change people's politics, I think. Thanks. Any other questions?
I have a question. Sorry. So I've read chapters of your book, so forgive me if I'm missing something because I didn't get a chance to read all of them. But I'm not really clear what exactly your thesis is. Is it just that people are complicated and that wherever you go, if you're friendly to them, they'll be friendly back to you? Or that's the majority of the time? Or is it that, I mean, am I supposed to take away something that I don't know? Keeping in mind that I recognize people are complicated,
right.
that there are multiple issues that people vote on.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, when I started out, I had no idea what I was going to find. I mean, I went on this trip based on the fact that I was curious and really fed up with the sound bites that we get in the media and the stereotypes that we get in the media. And I mean, I went to churches not knowing what I was going to find, random interviews in Walmarts. And some people have asked me this, like, so what is the message I'm supposed to take away from this? And I guess it is that I focus a lot on the media because it is so polarizing, and the media really does determine how we think. I mean, I don't think a lot of people realize how powerful they really are. We were just talking about third parties over lunch. And, Dennis Kucinich, for example, well, he's not really a third party, but he runs and he doesn't get any attention. He gets 30 seconds at the debate. Ron Paul, what kind of attention did he get? And he raised more money from active members of the military than John McCain. I mean, this is Ron Paul, who's more anti-war than the Democrats, for different reasons, of course. But it was just, I guess it was more of a, I don't like to use the word sociological experiment, but it was just more to kind of get past the soundbite and to give people a voice and to realize that these issues are not so black and white. That there are Republicans who, I mean, based on the media, it's like every Republican is anti-choice and hates the environment and goes to church and, I mean, my friends even said, I said, you guys, when I'm going to go on this trip, what comes to your mind when I say red state? They said fundamentalist, gun toter, ignorant, backwards. And these are my open-minded liberal friends, right? And then you have the same thing on the right. Liberal, what does that mean? Oh, we love taxes. We love handing out money to the poor. We love welfare. It's just so simplistic. And so the point really was to get past those sound bites. And, I mean, the thesis, okay, so I'm biased, obviously, but the thesis is that can we have a media that maybe challenges our assumptions, that gives us a little depth, that brings on these people that might challenge your stereotypes about who a Republican is? Or, you know what? How about going to an anti-war rally and finding a Bush voter? It's not hard. It's just, I think reporters are so lazy these days. The March for Women's Lives was this incredible march in 2005. 1 million people showed up, one of the largest marches in our history. And it got hardly any coverage. There were dads from Kansas. There were Republican grandmas from, Mississippi. I guess that the point is to kind of question your own assumptions and demand more from the media, because it's just so shallow. And I mean, think about the dialogue that we had during the 2008 election. It's still so surreal that that's the dialogue that we had. Like, in this country? I mean, we have so much media in this country. We should be the most well-informed people on the planet, and we're not. I know it's a long answer, and I don't have any one kind of soundbite, and that's kind of how you sell books. Seriously, it took me 2 years to find a publisher because it's like, this is about people. I think people would want to know more about how people in this country think and that it's not so black and white. And I had a hard time coming up with a paragraph. But thanks for your question.
I'm going to talk some more now. So given that you've talked a lot about how you're fed up with the media, and I think that a lot of people are, logistically, what do you think, should be done about it? What do you think that we could go do? What do you think that we could petition our Congress people to do? What do you think is the best way to change that?
Well, the FCC is going to deal with a lot of issues in the next year or two. So definitely get involved in that. Depending on who Obama appoints, it's going to affect net neutrality and so many other issues. Consolidation, how many TV stations can be owned by the same corporation. So that's more at the policy level, but it does matter. I work for a public radio station, and my show is supported 100% by listeners. We take no corporate underwriting. I never have had anyone tell me, don't ask this question or don't bring on this guest. It's completely independent. So it's very important to support independent radio. I mean, I just found out that I think we got more donors at the end of this year compared to last year, but they gave less money. It's not surprising. But, $20 matters, $10 matters. In fact, I subscribe to a really great website called Citizens for Legitimate Government. I think it's clg.org. And they just send me headlines every day, and they do such incredible work. I wouldn't know half the stuff happened because there's just so much going on. And I realized, wow, they're doing great work. I'm going to send them $50. And the woman who runs it said, thank you so much. You just gave me a month of server space or whatever. I mean, little things really do matter when it comes to supporting independent media. I mean, KALW runs on a budget of about $280,000 a year for our entire station. That's not much. And that's, from 2 to 5, we only have international news. We're completely independent. I would say find independent media that you really trust and then engage them. Because, for example, I get phone calls a lot from listeners, and they'll say, Rose, you're answering your phone? Yeah. We're just people. And we really appreciate the dialogue with our listeners. We get a lot of great show ideas from them. We wouldn't be here if it weren't for our listeners. So engage. I actually called Nancy Pelosi's office the other day about what's going on in Gaza. And I was really surprised because usually they only take your zip code. But this time, I could tell that the guy was getting a pad of paper and a pen. And he said, what is your address? What is your name? Please spell it. They're taking information. I mean, that stuff matters. And I think we're always fed these, sign my petition, join my Facebook, like all this stuff. So we often think that doesn't matter. But when you're talking about money for independent media, that's one way you can really get involved. And you know what? Help reporters. I mean, honestly, when I was covering the anti-war marches and I saw reporters with their makeup and their, suits covering for Channel 4 or Channel 7, I would tell them, that guy is a really great story. He served in Vietnam, his kid's in Iraq, he's against the war. Go interview him. It's just, there's great reporting out there. There's reporters who are putting their lives on the line every day in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I don't want to criticize the entire media. It's just cable TV has really tainted our society and has affected so many other things. One more question?
So I'm really curious to know, those firefighters who said, well, maybe, gay marriage and abortion aren't all that important in my new big scheme of things. Did you ever get any idea from talking to people why those things were way at the top of their agenda?
Because they hear about it every Sunday at church. And the so-called pro-life movement, anti-choice, whatever you want to call it, is very powerful in these towns. They have a lot of influence. And, a lot of people, like I said, their community is their church. And that's the issue that they hammer and hammer and hammer over and over and over again. And quite frankly, they're afraid. Prop 8 passed in California. And I've met a lot of people who said, I kind of regret voting for it. I really didn't know that it was going to take away so many rights. People are just afraid of change. They're getting this from the right-wing radio hosts on a regular basis. So, that's one of the main reasons. Thank you.